Okinawa, August 1945. The war was over, but the fear wasn't. A column of Japanese women walked slowly down a dirt path carved through shattered palms and burnt-out trucks. Their faces were pale, streaked with ash and exhaustion. Some still wore faded Red Cross armbands, others the remnants of field uniforms, stiff with dust and salt. For weeks they had hidden in caves, expecting to die. Every rumor they'd heard told them the same thing, that surrender meant humiliation, or worse. Ahead, through the smoke and silence, stood a line of American tents. Guards watched quietly, rifles lowered. A soft wind carried the smell of soap, metal, and boiling water. When the first woman stepped forward, trembling, a soldier gestured gently toward a basin. Steam rose from it, hot, clean water. She froze. Her eyes darted, waiting for the cruelty she'd been warned about. None came. Instead, a nurse handed her a towel. Another offered bread. Tears mixed with grime as she reached toward the steam, hesitant, disbelieving. For the first time in years, the heat wasn't from fire, it was mercy. And that moment marked the beginning of their reawakening. Japan's war machine in the 1930s and 1940s was built not just on steel and oil, but on ideology. Every classroom, every broadcast, every leaflet carried the same message. To surrender was to abandon your soul. By the time the Pacific War reached its height, even schoolgirls understood the word gyokusai, to shatter like a jewel. It meant dying honorably rather than living in shame. Women were taught that defeat was worse than death, and that the enemy, particularly the Americans, were beasts beyond redemption. When the empire expanded across Asia, thousands of Japanese women followed the military to the front lines. Many served as nurses in field hospitals on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Others were clerks, typists, or volunteers for the Red Cross. A few worked in communications or logistics, all bound by duty to the emperor. Their service was portrayed as sacred. To them, the war was not just national survival, it was spiritual purity against a world of corruption. But as the tide of war turned in 1944, that purity began to crack. The Battle of Saipan marked the first time Japanese civilians, including hundreds of women, came face to face with defeat. Allied forces landed with overwhelming power. Leaflets rained from the sky, promising fair treatment for those who surrendered, yet most ignored them. Propaganda from Tokyo insisted the Americans would torture, mutilate, or enslave any woman they captured. Mothers threw themselves and their children off cliffs. Nurses burned medical tents to erase all trace of surrender. This terror wasn't spontaneous. It was engineered. For years, military indoctrination had erased the distinction between soldier and civilian. Teachers drilled children to wield bamboo spears. Nurses were told that mercy toward the enemy was treason. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors declared, "Never live to experience shame as a prisoner." These words were carved into the moral fabric of the nation. By 1945, that code was absolute. Even when Japan's defeat became certain, the idea of captivity remained unthinkable. Women trapped in collapsing garrisons, on islands like Guam, the Philippines, and Okinawa, often chose suicide pacts over surrender. Yet a few survived. Caught in caves, abandoned field hospitals, or remote villages, they were taken prisoner, the unthinkable fate for a loyal subject of the emperor. What they expected next was horror. What awaited them was something entirely different, and for many, impossible to understand. In the Pacific War, captivity was a mirror that reflected the soul of each army. For the Japanese, surrender was dishonor. For the Allies, particularly the Americans, the treatment of prisoners was a moral line that defined civilization itself. By 1944, the US military had captured tens of thousands of Axis prisoners in Europe, The Geneva Convention of 1929 was clear. Prisoners were to be fed, housed, and treated with dignity. Camps were established with medical facilities, correspondence rights, and inspections by neutral observers. To American commanders, these standards were not an act of charity, but a matter of principle, proof that democracy could remain human, even in total war. The Pacific, however, was different. Japanese troops rarely surrendered. Those who did were often emaciated, delirious, or convinced they were about to be executed. Many Allied soldiers initially viewed their captives with suspicion or rage, haunted by reports from the Philippines and Bataan, where Japanese forces had massacred prisoners and civilians. Yet, despite the bitterness, Allied policy insisted on humane treatment. It was discipline, not emotion, that guided the camps. When the first Japanese women POWs arrived, nurses captured in Saipan, Guam, and later Okinawa, they were an anomaly. The US forces had prepared for male soldiers, not frightened civilians in tattered uniforms. Reports described the women arriving gaunt, dehydrated, and trembling. They refused to eat at first, fearing the food was poisoned. Some tried to hide razor blades or fragments of glass, intending to die before being defiled. The American and Australian medics who treated them faced a moral challenge unlike any battlefield encounter. These were the very people raised to see them as monsters. Yet here they were, frightened, malnourished, and human. The Allied nurses, many only a few years older than their captives, recognized something familiar: exhaustion, grief, and the same silent longing to survive. Eyewitness accounts tell of small, almost invisible acts of decency. A Japanese nurse given clean bandages for her wounded hands broke down in tears. Another, who had fainted during processing, awoke to find an American doctor covering her with a blanket. In one documented case from Okinawa, US Marines provided sanitary supplies and soap to captured Japanese women, items more valuable than gold in those final months of the war. These gestures, though routine for Allied forces, shattered the mythology that had dominated Japanese minds for a decade. The women expected brutality. What they received was order, hygiene, and discipline. To them, even being spoken to without violence felt unreal. What began as military protocol slowly became something larger, a quiet, unspoken reconciliation between two moral worlds. And that clash of perception, between terror and mercy, would become the emotional core of their captivity. Because when the guns fell silent, the war between ideals had only just begun. When the Japanese women were captured, their war did not end. It simply moved inside their minds. For years they had lived under air raids, hunger and disease, but nothing frightened them more than the thought of Allied captivity. Many had seen their brothers and fiancés die shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai," long live the Emperor. They had sworn to do the same if cornered. Yet when the final bombardments ended, there was no glorious last stand, only silence, and the heavy realization that death had not come. For the first time they had to face life, and it felt unbearable. Witnesses describe some POWs covering their faces whenever Allied soldiers approached, whispering prayers to die with honor. Others refused to undress for medical treatment, convinced it was a prelude to violation. Every step in the camp, every word spoken by guards carried the weight of imagined cruelty. And yet, day after day, that cruelty never came. Meals were served on schedule, medical staff checked wounds, soldiers saluted their officers with respect. Slowly, disbelief began to replace terror. They had not been captured by beasts. They had been captured by human beings. It was a revelation that no weapon could have delivered, a quiet, devastating truth that undid years of propaganda. To understand their shock, one must understand the culture that shaped them. The Japanese military system was built upon the Bushido Code, the way of the warrior. It glorified death, sacrifice, and loyalty to the emperor above all. Even women, though not combatants, were expected to embody its essence. Wartime magazines and radio broadcasts taught them that surrender would bring dishonor to their ancestors. The purity of womanhood, they were told, must never be tainted by the enemy. When the tide turned against Japan, this ideology grew even more desperate. In 1944, the imperial government distributed leaflets instructing women to commit suicide rather than be captured. Some were even given hand grenades for protection. The shame of survival was considered worse than death itself. Thus, when Allied soldiers treated them kindly, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like dissonance. The entire moral structure of their world trembled. If the enemy was capable of mercy, then everything they had believed might have been a lie. For a mind shaped by Bushido, that was a spiritual earthquake. Some women would later write in diaries that captivity felt like awakening into another world. A world where compassion was not weakness and where survival did not equal shame. War for Japanese women was never fought with rifles, but with endurance. They were the unseen backbone of the empire, nurses in field hospitals, clerks in supply depots, caretakers in wounded camps. Their lives were spent serving a machine that viewed them as both sacred and expendable. When defeat came, that contradiction surfaced in brutal clarity. Their value, once tied to service, now meant nothing. A captured woman was considered lost to society, unfit for marriage, unworthy of remembrance. Yet within Allied captivity, these same women began to rediscover their individual worth. They were treated not as soldiers or enemies, but as patients, as women, as human beings. Medical officers wrote of how the POWs, after weeks of silence, began humming songs during meals. Others cautiously practiced English phrases taught by nurses. The emotional thaw was slow but real. It was the quietest revolution of the war, not fought with weapons, but with decency. And for those women, that first spark of kindness was the beginning of their unlearning. The same unlearning that would later reshape Japan itself. To the Allied soldiers and nurses stationed in the Pacific, the war had been fought against a faceless enemy, one associated with the cruelty of Bataan, the burning of Nanking, and the kamikazes' suicidal fury. But when the first Japanese women POWs were brought in under guard, the enemy suddenly had faces, weary, frightened, and very human. Military reports from Saipan and Okinawa described the scene with restrained clarity. They were terrified beyond reason, one US Navy medic wrote. Even when handed food, they flinched as if struck. For American and Australian medical staff, these prisoners were both victims and testaments to endurance. The Geneva Convention was more than policy. It was a line separating civilization from barbarism. Every act of fairness became a quiet assertion of moral order amid the wreckage of total war. Guards were instructed to avoid shouting. Nurses distributed soap and fresh linen. Doctors treated infections and malnutrition. A few soldiers privately admitted that caring for their former enemy brought a strange sense of peace, as though by saving these women, they were redeeming something larger than victory itself. In those makeshift camps, compassion became an act of defiance, a way to prove that even after years of hatred, the human heart could still choose restraint. The treatment of Japanese women POWs carried profound moral weight. In the chaos of war's ending, vengeance would have been easy, perhaps even understandable. Allied forces had witnessed atrocities across Asia and the Pacific, civilians massacred, nurses executed, prisoners starved. And yet, when Japan's defeated soldiers and civilians surrendered, they were not met with retribution, but with process, order, and care. This was not forgiveness. It was discipline, a moral discipline born from democratic armies that saw mercy as strength, not weakness. By upholding the Geneva Convention even toward those who had not honored it, the Allies demonstrated something revolutionary, that justice could coexist with humanity. For the captured Japanese women, this moral inversion was almost unbearable. To them, mercy from the enemy was shame magnified. But as days passed, that shame began to dissolve into reflection. They had been raised to see compassion as a sign of fragility, yet here it was, shaping the behavior of a victorious army. The lesson was not political, it was spiritual. In the act of being treated with dignity, they saw a truth that propaganda could never erase, that civilization is measured not by conquest, but by restraint. The human mind cannot change overnight. The Japanese women POWs carried the weight of indoctrination so deep it shaped even their instincts. But within days of captivity, something subtle began to shift. At first they whispered to one another, afraid to speak openly. Some still bowed to Allied soldiers in apology. Others watched their captors carefully, trying to understand what they wanted. When they realized that no harm would come, that food arrived each morning, that guards treated them without mockery, disbelief gave way to an unfamiliar calm. Psychologists later called this ideological dissonance, the collapse of a worldview when confronted with contradictory reality. But in those camps, it felt like something simpler, the rediscovery of trust. Letters recovered after the war describe the moment vividly. One former nurse wrote, "I believed the Americans were devils, but they washed my wounds and gave me warm tea. I did not understand why." Another, interviewed in 1951, said, "When they gave us hot water to bathe, I cried. I had not felt clean since before the war. It was as if they washed away our fear." For them, that gesture was more than comfort. It was liberation. From fear, from lies, from the myth that humanity belonged to one nation alone. And as that understanding grew, the war inside their minds began to end. Okinawa, August 1945. Rain had fallen through the night. The camp smelled of wet earth, oil, and rusting tin. Dozens of Japanese women stood barefoot on the gravel outside a long canvas tent, their thin uniforms clinging to their skin. Their faces were expressionless, drained of fear, yet not yet capable of hope. They had been marched here for what they thought was interrogation. Inside the tent, American medics prepared the most ordinary of things, buckets of water, soap, and towels. To the prisoners, it looked like an execution room. An interpreter, a young Nisei, a Japanese-American soldier, tried to explain in halting Japanese that this was a bathing station. No one moved. The women whispered among themselves, "They will strip us. They will shame us." The rumors had said it all. Finally, one nurse, perhaps braver, perhaps simply too tired to resist, stepped forward. Her name, recorded in Allied medical logs, was Lieutenant Chiyoko Tanaka, age 24. She had served in a field hospital near Shuri before the final bombardment destroyed it. Her hands still bore the burns from sterilizing instruments over open flames. A medic gestured toward a basin. Steam drifted upward. Chiyoko froze. Hot water, clean water, had not touched her skin in months. The last time she had bathed was in a puddle of rainwater, weeks before capture. Now she stared at the basin as if it were a trick of the light. The soldier held out a bar of soap. The interpreter repeated softly, "It's all right. For washing." She hesitated, then reached out. Her hand trembled as her fingers brushed the steam. It was real. Warmth. Not from fire, not from bombs, but from human hands preparing something meant for comfort, not pain. She began to wash her face. Dirt streaked down in grey rivulets. Others watched in silence, one by one, stepping forward. Within minutes, the tent was filled, with quiet sobs and the sound of water splashing against metal basins. For the American medics, it was routine hygiene. For the Japanese women, it was rebirth. One of the nurses later recalled, "The water felt like forgiveness." In that moment, the lines between captor and captive blurred, not erased, but softened by something older than war itself. Outside, the rain eased. A soldier closed his notebook, marking down the day's supplies. But what was happening inside that tent could not be counted in rations or records. It was the first moment in which the myth of the inhuman enemy dissolved, quietly, without ceremony, in the rising steam of mercy. The next morning, the air over the camp was still. The war's echo, artillery, engines, screams, had faded into a kind of suspended quiet. Rows of tents stood against the grey sea, their canvas edges fluttering in the coastal wind. Inside the infirmary, the Japanese women sat wrapped in clean blankets, their hair damp from washing. The transformation was almost unrecognizable. Faces that had been hollow with terror were now pale but composed. They looked at their captors differently, not with trust, but with comprehension. An American nurse, Lieutenant Helen Crawford, recorded in her field journal, "They seemed astonished that we smiled. One asked through the interpreter why we treated them like this. I told her, because that's what soldiers do when the fighting's over." That simple answer carried a weight greater than any speech. For the Japanese women who had been taught that surrender erased their humanity, this act of respect was impossible to reconcile. They had been prepared to die. Instead, they were being cared for by those they'd been told were monsters. When Lieutenant Tanaka bowed to Helen Crawford, the gesture was hesitant, part gratitude, part disbelief. The American nurse returned the bow without irony. The interpreter watched the exchange in silence, realizing what neither could fully express, that this moment, brief and wordless, was the first bridge between two moral worlds divided by war. Over the next days, the women were assigned quarters, given meals, and permitted rest. Allied doctors treated infected wounds and malnutrition. One diary entry from a Japanese Red Cross volunteer described the experience. "They gave us rice, white rice. I thought it was a dream. They let us rest on cots. The sound of boots outside did not make me afraid anymore." For Allied soldiers hardened by years of brutality, these tasks were routine, yet deeply symbolic. They were proof that even amid the wreckage of total war, the laws of humanity still functioned. And for the Japanese captives, every gesture, a blanket folded neatly, a word of reassurance, struck deeper than gunfire. It contradicted the entire architecture of fear that had defined their lives. Their war had been one of absolutes, life or death, honor or shame, victory or annihilation. Now, in the aftermath of defeat, they discovered something far more complex, the unsettling mercy of those who had every reason to hate them. Some wept quietly as they realized this. Others sat staring at the sky, the clouds moving gently over Okinawa's ruined hills. They no longer knew what to believe. But for the first time, belief itself felt possible again. That moment, the giving of hot water, of food, of dignity, was not merely a kindness. It was the unmaking of war. And from that unmaking, the long road to reconciliation would begin. By September 1945, the Pacific War had ended. The Empire of Japan lay in ruins, its cities ash and silence, its soldiers scattered across the islands they once swore to defend to the last breath. The women who had been captured on Okinawa, Saipan, and Guam were now officially classified as prisoners of war, Category C. Civilians attached to the military, awaiting repatriation under Allied supervision. They were transferred to collection centres, guarded but not as inmates. The rules were strict yet humane, scheduled meals, medical checks, and controlled correspondence. For many, it was the first time they had been free of command, fear, and hunger in years. In those months, Allied records noted something remarkable. Unlike most captured soldiers, the Japanese women caused no disciplinary problems. They worked quietly, cleaned their quarters, and sometimes offered to assist in the infirmary. A few even helped translate for new arrivals, women still shaking, still refusing to eat. The former captives had become caretakers of those who hadn't yet learned to stop being afraid. American officers described them as polite to a fault but haunted. At night, camp guards reported hearing faint weeping, not of sorrow but of release. One Japanese nurse later wrote in her journal, "For the first time, I slept without dreaming of explosions." When the process of repatriation began in early 1946, the women were gathered at temporary ports under US and Australian command. They received fresh uniforms marked POW, return to Japan, medical clearances, and simple rations for the journey home. The ship decks were quiet. Some stared eastward for hours, afraid of what awaited them more than what they were leaving behind. Because in Japan, surrender was still a stigma that clung like smoke. Those who returned often faced silence from their communities. Many families could not comprehend that Allied captivity had been anything other than horror. Some women concealed their experience, inventing stories of being stranded or hidden to avoid the shame of survival. Others wrote privately to the nurses who had treated them, sending small gifts or letters of thanks through Red Cross intermediaries. These letters, preserved in archives decades later, reveal a rare tenderness, fragments of reconciliation that transcended language. One letter, dated October 1946, reads, "To the nurse who gave me hot water, you showed me that strength is not in dying for a nation, but in living for humanity. I carry that warmth with me always." It was signed only Kei Nakamura, former nurse, Okinawa. The war had been fought with steel, but it ended in gestures like this, unseen, unrecorded by history books, yet powerful enough to bend the course of memory itself. The world was rebuilding. But for those who had stood on both sides of that line, one offering mercy, the other learning to receive it, the rebuilding had already begun in their hearts. Years later, when the world spoke of the Pacific War, it remembered the firebombs, the mushroom clouds, and the brutality that devoured entire islands. But quietly, buried beneath the noise of history, lived stories like these, stories of mercy given to those who had been taught to expect none. In 1950, an American officer named Captain Robert Lang, who had supervised the care of Japanese female POWs on Guam, returned to civilian life. In his memoir, he wrote, "I came to hate the war not because of what I saw done in anger, but because of what we learned was possible in kindness." He described a single moment, a young Japanese nurse handing him a folded paper crane before boarding the repatriation ship. She had made it from a hospital ration ticket. It bore no words, but the gesture said everything the treaties could not. Across the sea, in a Tokyo still hollow from defeat, some of the women who survived captivity began quietly serving in post-war hospitals. A few even joined international aid organizations, the same Red Cross that had once saved them. They avoided speaking of their pasts, yet their patients noticed their gentleness, the way they lingered when bandaging a wound, or how they bowed slightly before entering a sick room, as if honoring an unspoken memory. In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, one of these women, Sato Misako, a former army nurse, stood before a crowd of students in Hiroshima and said, "I once believed mercy was weakness, but it was mercy that rebuilt me." Her words, printed in a local newspaper, sparked quiet discussion in a society still struggling to define honor after catastrophe. For the first time, Japan began to remember not only the soldiers who died, but also those who lived, the women who crossed the line between fear and forgiveness. Historians later traced these small testimonies as the hidden roots of Japan's post-war humanitarian culture. For every act of cruelty that defined the Pacific War, there had been acts of compassion that defied it, not enough to erase the horror, but enough to remind the world that humanity could still flicker amid the ashes. Archival footage fades to black and white, the voiceover softens as the camera pans across calm seas, the same Pacific that once burned. In every war, mercy is the rarest victory. It asks for courage greater than the fight itself, the courage to see the enemy as human, even when history demands otherwise. The music swells, strings and distant choir. For the Japanese women who survived captivity, And for the Allied soldiers who gave them life instead of death, that mercy became their quiet revolution. A revolution not written in treaties, but in the way they healed the world after breaking it. Fade out. The screen darkens to a single line of text. Mercy, the war's final act.